So then let me call to order the special meeting of the Glendale City Council on Tuesday, January 20th, 2009. Now everyone's moving. Something I said, something I did. Let's call the roll.
Council members Najarian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Mayor Draymond.
Here. All right. And let's hear the report, please.
Director of Planning continued November 18, 2008. Proposed ordinance amending Title 1, 2, and 30 of the Glendale Municipal Code and the South Brand Boulevard Specific Plan relating generally to the codification of zoning code interpretations, miscellaneous revisions, and minor cleanups PZON 2008-005, and resolution establishing new fees associated with time extension requests.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see Mr. Hagani standing at the lectern, so let me go to Mr. Hagani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, for allowing us to take this special time in the afternoon to go over a number of zoning code items that are not the easiest to deal with, not because they're complicated, but because we cannot find the perfect solution for each one of them. With your permission, Mr. Mayor, we have produced a PowerPoint presentation mainly because some of the concepts that we're discussing should follow a chain of discussions that the Zoning Code Advisory Group has participated in, and we wanted to be fair and cover everything and not forget any piece of it.
You said this is a PowerPoint, Mr. Hagani?
Yes, sir.
No.
No?
No, I wanted to say that for 2 years. It's finally my opportunity. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
And we wanted to thank especially the Zoning Code Advisory Group, the community members who work with us each time. And this is a particularly tedious affair because we give them a lot of homework to prepare, and they come for detailed discussions on the nitty-gritty of the zoning code. And what you'll see today, Kristen Asp and Wolfgang Krauss are going to highlight the 4 pieces of the proposal in front of you, and then the rest will be left for discussion. They're not as complicated as these 4 particular topics. The zoning administrator was planning on being here to answer any questions regarding some of those. Unfortunately, she's sick today. She called and apologized for not making it. Kristen Asp is going to start the presentation.
Okay, and before you do, let me just let my colleagues know that we also have some speaker cards, so we will be hearing from the public as well today. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Yusuf.
I'm not going to ask any questions while the presentation is going, but I would like, because I want to hear your presentation. It may answer some of my questions, but after it's done, I have several questions, so then I can ask if it wasn't answered.
Yeah, and just you bring up a good point. Just to recap, because we were away for a few weeks and now we're back. Let me just remind my colleagues that is the policy that when I'm chairing a meeting that I have tried to set for the last year. We will give the presentation. We don't interrupt the presenter, whether it's staff or someone from the community, with questions during their presentation. Let them get through it. And then I always go to my colleagues to see if they have any questions or comments before we go to the public. We then go to the public, and then we come back to my colleagues to see whether they have any follow-up questions, comments, or direction to give staff. So that has been the procedure for more or less, well, almost a year now. So that'll also be the procedure today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Just to start off how this presentation is structured a bit, the 4 topics will be discussed. We'll start with what the current zoning code permits and some of the issues, what the Zoning Code Advisory Group discussed, what eventually the Planning Commission discussed and recommended, and then any follow-up to that. So that's sort of the structure of each one of the topics. The first item relates to rooftop equipment, specifically in the single-family zones. Currently, the zoning code does not permit new rooftop equipment in single-family zones, although replacement equipment is permitted. There is an administrative exception process to seek relief from this prohibition. However, during the summer months, when homeowners are looking to install air conditioning on the roof. They are often upset and frustrated by this restriction and the administrative exception process. If approved, the administrative exception process almost always requires screening, and sometimes screening can draw more attention to the roof than just the equipment alone. Good screening is and has been difficult to come by and achieve, and altering a roof, redesigning the ridge line to conceal it, is often expensive. So we hear from both sides, both residents from both sides of the issue, and there appears to be a divide of those who like to have air conditioning equipment and those are concerned about the aesthetics and the screening. When we discussed this with the Zoning Code Advisory Group, we outlined some options for them to consider, 3 options. The first being no change, to keep the current administrative exception process. The second option would be to permit equipment at a reasonable rear portion of the roof and screen only that portion that may be visible from the public street adjacent to the property. This option could be more burdensome to properties that are located on a corner or have a double frontage lot. And the third option was to permit equipment at a reasonable rear portion of the roof and not require any screening. During the Zoning Code Advisory Group discussions, they talked about all sorts of issues from noise to the size and type of equipment to poor screening and concerns about the neighborhood. In the end, no consensus was reached between that group. In fact, the decision was, or the opinions were quite varied from the spectrum to, at one end of the spectrum being to just allow rooftop equipment, period, and let staff decide on where it should be located on the roof and if and when it should be screened, to keeping the current administrative exception process, to the other end of the spectrum of expanding the administrative exception process and requiring more information when reviewing an application. In the end of the discussion, there did not appear to be a push from either side to change the current process. So when the Planning Commission reviewed what the Zoning Code Advisory Group discussed, it went with their recommendation of just maintaining the current code regulations, but they did want to pass along that to either encourage during the administrative section process, because it is a discretionary action, it is decided on a case-by-case basis, that if screening of the equipment would draw much more attention to the equipment than just the equipment alone, to try and use some flexibility and discretion of when screening is approved or required. So based on that, staff is recommending to maintain the current administrative exception process. Like I said, it is a discretionary action. The zoning administrator considers applications and can approve them with conditions, and require or not require things like screening, as well as deny an application. These have just been examples of equipment and screening at various parts of the city. So the next topic that we discussed relates to walls and fences, and I want to be very clear that the discussion about walls and fences does not include illegal walls and fences. For example, a wall or fence that may be located within a required setback, which is prohibited. This is not a discussion about this. This is only a discussion on walls and fences as it relates to design review. Currently, the code does not require design review for walls and fences, but there's been some concern from the community regarding the aesthetic look. Recently, there's been changes to the Glendale Building and Safety Code that have exempted a building permit requirement for any wall or fence up to 6 feet in height. It was previously at 4 feet, and so now planning staff is almost never aware of when a wall or fence is being installed or constructed. So when the Zoning Code Advisory Group discussed this issue, again, we had some options for them to consider. The first being to maintain the status quo and not review walls and fences in regards to design review. The second option was to not require a permit for walls and fences, but to create specific standards in the code that they must meet, such as height and approved materials. And if there was a deviation from materials, allow consideration through a staff design review. And the third option was to require walls and fences over 4 feet in height to be subject to design review. Staff would have the discretion through that process to exempt a wall or fence or to send it to the design review board. This process could add considerably to the time and expense to property owners, given the submittal requirements and noticing costs associated with an application. And most often, any kind of review on a wall or fence will occur after the wall or fence is already built, because a building permit is no longer required. And it would probably be on a complaint basis of when we would know about these things. And so this process would only be as good or work when an applicant informs staff beforehand that they're considering constructing a wall or fence. So there's some concern about any benefit gained outweighing the time and cost placed on a property owner for this process. The Zoning Code Advisory Group discussed these options. Again, there was significant opinions ranging from no review, review for anything over 6 feet in height, to only limiting review to walls and fences that may face a public street. But at the end of the discussion, the majority of the group did feel that anything above 4 feet in height was significant to be subject to the design review process. However, when the Planning Commission discussed this, they recommended the second option that the Zoning Code Advisory Group reviewed, which was to create specific standards for walls and fences in the code, but left it to staff to draft those standards. So staff has drafted some standards, and this summarizes this in the summarized in the chart here in terms of height and location. And you can see between a dwelling unit and the front setback line, the maximum height would be 4 feet, but there would be some built-in flexibility for an additional 2 feet if there's a topography issue. And then elsewhere on the lot, as well as on a street side setback line. And this would just cover standards related to materials, a handful of different materials, and again, allowing some flexibility for other decorative materials to be considered and approved by staff. And while we drafted these standards, some concerns that staff still has is that since the building code changes of January 1st, 2008, removed the requirement for any permits under 6 feet, there's no way for us to know when a wall or fence is installed. And even further, these standards will likely cause an unknown number of walls and fences to become non-conforming, even if they were installed legally with a permit. In order for us to establish whether or not a fence was installed legally, we would need to do a citywide survey, which would be very labor intensive, but without it, enforcement would be difficult. And, you know, again, these standards were drafted and I think reflect what we heard from both the Zoning Code Advisory Group and the Planning Commission, but we just have concerns about enforceability and the overall design value achieved with them. And here's a few examples of fences.
Can you just describe what, not a question, Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, but describe what you're showing us. Is that a 4-foot fence? Is that a 5-foot fence? And how far, is it within, legal, within?
This is an example of a street side fence outside the street side setback, and I'm going to estimate that that's probably close to 6 feet in height. So again, located outside of a setback and permitted. So an example like this does not require a building permit based on that assumption. Okay. The third topic relates to non-conforming buildings and structures. specifically the 50% demolition rule related as it relates to termites, dry rot, mold, other natural deterioration. Currently, the code requires that if more than 50% of the combined area of exterior walls and roof are replaced or reconstructed voluntarily, the building loses its nonconforming status and must comply with current zoning standards. The majority of cases where this is an issue concerns really the residential interior setbacks. The zoning administrator has given some exemptions to this rule when a building is determined to be termite dry rot damaged, and that exemption process included a letter from an engineer addressing the safety, as well as a report from a termite company, and then taking that information and consulting with the city's building and safety department to verify and determine that the existing walls are unsafe. Typically, termite, dry rot damage, other natural deterioration is not considered similar to a natural disaster like fire or an accident that the zoning code deals with differently, which is why the zoning administrator is asking for some policy direction to either codify this process or to prohibit it altogether. The 50% rule, or that 50% number, was put in place as the lowest threshold to justify that a significant portion of the building was remaining and therefore could maintain its existing nonconformities. Anything over that 50% number would then be considered a new building and must comply with current zoning standards. And this supports the theory of nonconformities and eliminating nonconformities, that when a building is past its useful life, it be replaced with a code-conforming building. The Zoning Code Advisory Group discussed this issue, and they had some concerns about applicants or property owners abusing a process if one was put in place to address termite damage. There was not total agreement between the group, but the majority did sympathize with a property owner or an applicant if they truly didn't know how much damage they had, and that an exemption or a waiver from the 50% rule should be applicable with supporting evidence, like the zoning administrator process I described, and could rebuild their building in substantially the same location as it existed before. Included in this staff report, the cover memo, was a piece of communication from the Verdugo Woodlands West Homeowners Association that's specific to this topic, and it basically expresses opposition to liberalizing the current 50% rule related to this type of normal deterioration, and this same communication was brought up during the Planning Commission hearing. And I also believe there was an email from the Northwest Glendale Homeowners Association that addresses this matter as well. So when the Planning Commission reviewed this, they recommended a process for allowing consideration of termite damage to be exempt from the 50% rule. And their goal was to create an administrative process that would minimize potential abuse and require investigation prior to a building permit being issued. And forgive me for this slide with a lot of verbiage, but the Planning Commission recommendation sort of has four prongs or 4 points, and so I think this would just be helpful to those following along to keep track of all of their recommendations. The first point of their recommendation was to require a termite report if a project proposes removal greater than 33%, and also included with that a signed statement by the designer that they are unaware of any additional damage. Second part, if termite damage results in over 50% removal, the building must comply with all current zoning regulations. The third piece is that if damage is discovered during construction, to use the ZA policy that I described earlier of an engineer's report and a termite report and verification, the building can be allowed to maintain its non-conforming status. However, if that damage area is removed before the ZA is able to verify it, they lose their non-conforming status, and the building must be built to current zoning regulations. The commission also wanted to pass along, although not part of the recommendation, that there were some concerns raised at the hearing from the design community about having to sign a waiver and that they are not aware of any more damage, termite damage to the building, and so there were some concerns raised about increased liability from that. So with this four-pronged approach from the Planning Commission recommendation, staff took a look at it and was trying to really see how we could implement this. And upon further investigation, we felt that a lot of this has some impracticalities when trying to implement it. We're concerned that there's no incentive to find out if there's any damage prior to construction, so there's almost a benefit or reward to delaying discovery of any kind of damage. And based on that, staff just believes it would be better to either include termite damage as involuntary damage, similar to a fire or an accident, or to clearly bar termite damage as involuntary demolition. But some options for council to consider is to either consider the Planning Commission's recommendation, the zoning administrator's procedure, or to not consider termite damage, dry rot, mold, etc., as justification to waive the 50% rule and to just state that in the code. Then the fourth topic I'm going to turn over to Wolfgang Kraus, relates to residential interior setbacks.
Thank you, Kristen. Yes, the fourth topic that we're going to be discussing is the interior setback requirements in the two of the three single-family zones, the R1 and the R1R. We've had different side yard, rear yard / interior setback requirements over the years. Currently, since '91, we've got two different standards. One applies to new houses built after May 2nd, 1991, and those added on to after, well, those houses that were constructed after that and added on to after May 2nd, 1991, and those houses that are added on to that had originally been constructed prior to May 2nd, 1991. So under the current code, if you're proposing a new house, well then in the R1 zone you've got a 6-foot interior setback. That's everything except a street, side, rear, whatever you want to call it. Code calls it interior setbacks. So it's 6 feet minimum for the R1 zone and 10 feet minimum for the R1R zone. That would not change. This is an example of the 4, 5, 6-foot rule, which is the rule predating the '91 changes, a situation involving an addition. For several years prior to the change to 6 foot and 10 foot being the minimum requirements, the interior setback was 4 feet for houses that were less than 20 feet, 5 feet for those between 20 and 30 feet, and 6 foot minimum interior setback for those over 30 feet high. The principle being the taller the building, the greater the setback should be, except that there's so many different variations of that, and the 2 foot difference really isn't a significant difference. So over the years, our experience told us that, us being the staff, that it didn't seem to be worth the trouble to have such a varied rule. But when it got changed in '91 as part of the anti-mansionization rules, it was felt that it would be appropriate to leave that rule in effect for people that did additions later on. That used to apply in the ROS zone as well. We eliminated that with the Hillside Ordinance in '93 because there's hardly any houses in the ROS zone. So as staff, we've been actually wanting to eliminate the 4, 5, 6 foot rule since the early '90s. So here we are as part of this big overall code amendment. An example of an older house that you would be adding on to that was 1 story, less than 20 feet in height, got a 4-foot existing interior setback, so the addition can be built in line with that. Well, in a way that's a good thing, but if the addition is too big, then you have a long straight wall, which kind of defies one of the objectives of or is contrary to one of the objectives of design review, which is to break up some of the massing. Another situation where you've got a conforming situation where your building is under 20 feet and you're going to a house that, well, no, this is actually an example that's already 2 stories in height. I'm sorry. So it's already greater than 20 feet, so it's already legal non-conforming. So only the addition has to have the 5-foot setback because the rest of the house is legal non-conforming. Not a bad situation, fairly easy to accomplish. So we get several of those. Next slide. Here's where the problem comes in often. You might be having a 1-story house that's less than 20 and you're trying to do a 2nd-story addition, and the addition might be nowhere near where your actual minimum setback is, but the fact that you have a 4-foot setback right now for a 1-story house means you're conforming, so you can't then go to a non-conforming situation. So if you want to do that 2nd-story addition, you actually have to take a foot off of the, in that case, right-hand side of the house. What that's resulted in is many requests for variances over the years, most of which have been granted. They're not all that situation, but that situation there is fairly common. And what the proposed code is regardless of what your interior setback is, the addition would have to conform to the 6-foot or 10-foot setback, depending on which zone you're in. 6 foot for R1, 10 foot for R1R. Simplifies everything, means you don't have to tear down parts of your house that are legal non-conforming. Don't have to worry about some of the situations that we've had. Don't have to apply for variance. So one of the advantages of doing this is it gets rid of that double standard that we have now. And so when we brought this to the Zoning Code Advisory Group, they agreed that this simplified approach is the way to go, and they recommended approval of that. When we took it to Planning Commission, they agreed. We gave them a possibility of an additional criteria where you could have a one-time addition in certain situations following a 4-foot setback, but they thought that this would be too complicated to track, and so in the end they just recommended that the 4, 5, 6 portion relating to older houses be removed, that we simply have the one standard for interior setbacks for each of the single-family zones. And related to that, we've had a push over the last few years in the R1R zone to actually increase the 10-foot requirement in some cases to a bigger number. So, but these are the 2 setbacks that were determined back in '91. Again, staff is hoping to have that apply, as is Planning Commission, to all situations involving additions. Thank you. And then, Kristen, you're going to carry on from here for a while and ask if there are any questions. Is that what we're doing?
That concludes summarizing the 4 major changes. The other 2 sections of the staff report cover zoning administrator interpretations as well as minor revisions and cleanups. There was general consensus from the Zoning Code Advisory Group and Planning Commission on those issues, so unless there's anything specific, I'm not going to cover those, but we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you very much. Excuse me, before I move on, are you saying to me that that concludes the presentation other than questions?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Let me start at this end. Mr. Weaver, do you have any questions, comments before we go to the public?
No, I'll listen to the public first, I think, and then...
Okay. Mr. Quintero.
For the public comments.
Mr. Najarian?
I have a few questions on the photos, if Kristen can clarify. To start with the roof equipment.
Okay.
If you could, tell me what it is that we're looking at. Is that something that was legal? Is this something staff recommended? Is this what current state is? What is this represent?
This is current. This is a series of pictures that I had asked the building inspector who checks these to go out and take some pictures of just examples. This would be an example of equipment that is screened and apparently was permitted, and just that's the equipment and that's the screening. And I can say from a practical standpoint of having to work the counter and having to review some of these things, screening is difficult to review and approve over the counter.
Okay, and this one here,
Is just equipment without screening.
okay. There's screening on that one currently.
Screening, and
That's the lattice.
yeah.
And this.
This is an example of,
Is that legal?
I believe so.
I mean, someone applied for a permit and
They
gave
call-
you a rough drawing as to what the screening is going to be, the material.
So they call that the lobster cage.
Fire hazard.
Was that what it is?
And is there a follow-up? In other words, we go back to inspect to see if it is matching the permit
The building inspector verifies.
verifies.
Mhm.
So if that matches what was turned into the counter, he can't say anything.
Correct.
Okay?
And this is actually a case of,
That doesn't look too bad, actually.
and it varies from roof to roof, depending on the location and architectural style of the existing structure.
And then could you move to the fences then?
Oh, okay. The pictures?
Yes.
Okay.
So what are we looking at here? This is a
This-
front
This is an
setback?
example of a fence outside, just outside the front yard setback.
Okay. And it's wrought iron,
I believe it's a wrought iron,
and it's 5-6 feet perhaps?
approximately 5-6 feet in height.
Sheet metal?
Sheet
Metal
metal?
behind it.
Okay. Legal or illegal?
Legal.
Legal.
Today.
Oh, that's the same fence there? I see. Okay.
So showing that it's
Okay.
maintaining the setback.
All right. And the next,
And
looked at that already.
so this is a corner property.
Okay.
So the grass closer in the forefront of the picture is a house orientated to the street with the trash cans, and the fence on the property on the corner is really
This.
the house is oriented to
Right,
the
to
street
the
at
other
the end of
street.
the- at the end of the street.
perpendicular street. So there's
Correct.
no limit on the side, on the height of a street side?
There's
Or is it the
no
6
height
foot?
limits on fences, but most of the time people are 6 feet and under, because the building and safety code does require more engineering and more plans for anything over 6 feet.
So another set of regulations.
Mhm.
Okay. I think that was the last one.
I believe. Is the picture.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Yusefian?
Oh, wait.
Okay. Thank you. There we are. Welcome back, Mr. Kasakian. Good to see you.
It's good to be seen. Thank you.
We'll go to the public now. Let's hear from Myrna Stanley, followed by Laura Frieden.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and council member and staff. My name is Myrna Stanley. I'm president of Verdugo Woodlands West Homeowners Association. And my board unanimously voted to recommend that you eliminate termites from the 50%, what we're calling the 50% demolition rule. But if I could backtrack for just a second to walls and fences, I don't know what the solution is, but I'll tell you, anything over 3 feet is a problem. As the examples should tell you that, but especially on corner properties, I mean, it really cuts off your vision. It has more of an impact, and I think you really have to give that a lot of thought. Back to termites, I don't know where to start. This is so bad. You'll remember that we gave you all this little brochure. I hope you still have it. If you don't, I can send it to you electronically. But we were specifically calling out a project on our wonderful Neodrara Drive in the Verdugo Woodlands, which, who has the CD? Somebody has this. We gave the CD for a PowerPoint?
There is a very small estate. Well, I shouldn't say small, but it's on an acre, a good acre of land. But the estate was low profile, and I understand it belonged to the Apple Coffee family. It's been there for a long time. If you could, do you have that? That's in our brochure. And the next one, Kristen, please. Does this house need to be updated? Yes. It needs paint. It needs a lot of things, new landscaping, etc. But it's a wonderful home. It has a natural stream flowing in front of it. It's very, very close to Verdugo Park. And if you'll show the next slide, this is in '07 when everything was torn down, including that side wall that you see. That eventually was torn down. And when we called, and there was at least 3 stop work orders that I'm aware of on this property, it was due to alleged termite damage. Now, you need to know that the current owners of this house, I think they were there either 10 years or less, so the lender at that time would have required a termite report, and it's very suspect that termites could eat that much in 10 years, frankly. So if you'll show the next slide. This is in '08, and this is all without design review, folks. This is termite damage again. If you can just look at what we now have a balcony on the south side. We have all this wonderful hardscape. We have balconies in the front. Is it a pretty house? Yeah, in Bel Air on 2 acres maybe. The garage is now a 3-car garage. And the next slide, please. This will tell you what it is in '09. Between the former slide and this one, there was a stop work order, and now we have, here we go again, do you call them fences or walls? We have balustrades now. And that was after a stop work order was issued.
Let me interrupt for a moment. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Of course.
I had indicated to the city clerk that we would take 3 minutes for speakers. If my colleagues will go along, just 1 second, Mr. Yusefian. Let me extend that to 5 minutes. We only have 3 speakers.
No objection.
Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Dan.
No, that's quite all right. I just want you to see what can happen and how this whole termite thing can be abused. And this is not the only one. We have another one that's coming up shortly on another street, all to alleged termite damage. And all this without design review. So there you have your fence and wall issue. Now, those are outside the setback, just so you know. A lot of fences and walls are put up, and they look innocuous in the beginning, and then they start putting light standards on them, and you've got Vegas, folks. So I don't know if lights are going on there. I certainly hope not. But there's a lot of issues here other than what's before you right now. I understand that. But this is not good. This is not good at all. And the zoning administrator asked for verification from the architect and the civil engineer that there was extensive termite damage, and she received it. So she's going along with code, although, frankly, our position is that that house is much higher than the original one, as pointed out in our little brochure. But there you have it.
Could we see the picture before?
Sure. Kristen?
Okay, this is before. Now go back. Up.
You sure changed the landscaping in front.
Okay.
What?
There's a comparison. There you go.
Oh,
there you
okay.
go.
Really
That'll
changed,
give you a good...
really changed the landscaping.
You know, there was
Landscaping.
Councilman Weaver. There was a landscaping in the front, kind of rolling down, everything. Now, this is a good-sized property, and as I said, that those, you don't know where to start. It's such a shame, and it's going to be there for 75 years. But thank you for your time. I'm anxious to hear your comments.
All right. Laura Friedman, followed by Franco Norabian.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Friedman. First, I'd like to thank the Council for agendizing this item and to thank staff for the hard work they've put in and the recommendations that they've put in. I'm here as a longtime Design Review Board commissioner. I was actually on the Design Review Board when that exact house came in front of us, because it actually did come in front of Design Review. And this was a very important property for the neighborhood. There were a lot of people who came out to oppose the initial design, which was actually somewhat similar to what was eventually built. And the project was rejected by Design Review Board. So I was very frustrated to watch, over the years, a new house be built without review. And I felt that it was really a shame that the public never had the chance to come back and weigh in on the new project. And it's just as frustrating to me when I hear from people in the neighborhood a real lack of understanding of how a new house could be built that doesn't resemble the old house, that doesn't have the landscaping that we tend to require in the Verdugo woodlands. And to find out that it was because of this termite damage. And perhaps tearing the house down and allowing some non-conforming status might have made some sense, but I don't understand why such a different design would be approved without the project coming back for some kind of review. I understand the difficulties of trying to craft an ordinance that allows for enough flexibility so that people who have older homes that suffer this kind of termite damage are able to move forward without undue hardship. But at the same time, we have to craft something that does not allow people to take advantage of that ordinance, and that also will allow our older homes to be upgraded as they're replaced and as they're repaired. In the same way that you don't have carte blanche to come in and put in old unsafe piping and old sorts of building materials when you upgrade a house, we have the same sort of desire to have the zoning, the new zoning regulations be brought forward in new development. So I do believe that we need to adopt a much more strict threshold for the 50% rule so that it's not something that becomes a benefit to people. Because I think that everybody should have to follow the same process regardless of why your house is being demolished. We have to continue to allow public review. In terms of the fence ordinance, a few years ago there was a study group that put together a lot of very good recommendations about the fence ordinance, and I think that's something that we might as a city want to take another look at and look back into those recommendations. I agree that those fences that are shown are troubling. I think that we need to have some kind of a process by which planning staff can review these, because building and safety really looks at safety. They don't look at aesthetics, and they shouldn't. That's not really what they were hired to do. I agree with staff that sending all of these to design review might be going overboard and become too difficult. I have a lot of confidence in our planning staff and the senior staff members in giving exemptions when necessary, and also in requiring design review board review when they feel it's necessary. I do think to that end that we need to come up with guidelines for fences in the various design guidelines that we have for the city, so that people have guidance, so that builders have guidance, and also so that staff has guidance. So with that, I appreciate your taking this issue up, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Friedman. Yes, sir. You are next. Norabian, Ms. Franco Norabian.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. My name is Franco Norabian. I'm an architect here in Glendale. I just wanted to address my concern about the change in the residential setbacks from 456 to, and I don't have a problem with the change proposed in R1 zone. But in R1R, the change that's being proposed is to go from a 456 to a 10-foot setback. And I don't know if you realize this, but there are a lot of one-story homes in R1R neighborhoods. And currently, the way the code is, if you keep a 4-foot or 5-foot, whatever it is, with the height of the building, you're able to, for example, add a one-story room addition to a one-story home, because you have enough room in some cases. By changing that from 4-foot to 10-foot, that's not a minor change, that's a big change, and it would prohibit a lot of homeowners from being able to do small additions to their home, and it would force them to either not do anything at all, or if they still want to do it, it would actually encourage people to do a second-story addition, because you're restricting their footprint by increasing the setback, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think one-story additions are less complicated. If I was a neighbor, I would prefer to have somebody build a new home and have their 5-foot setback rather than be 10 feet away but be a 2-story house. So I think on both sides, for the neighbors it's not a good thing, and for the people, the applicants trying to add on to their home, is not a good thing. So, and I'm sorry I didn't get involved earlier with this. I wasn't part of the neighborhood discussions. When I first heard minor changes, I didn't think it would affect architects or applicants that much. But I think the R1R neighborhoods, it will make a big difference. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rowe. Appreciate that. Our last speaker is Herbert Milano.
Mayor Draymond, members of the City Council, my name is Herbert Milano. Now, I don't live in Glendale at this moment. Am I still allowed to speak on this topic?
I think you know you are, Mr. Milano.
Oh, all right, because if not, when Mr. Caruso comes over, I can maybe call their attention to the fact that he lives in Los Angeles. I guess there's an advantage of living in Tujunga in the following way. Because the city of LA is so large and to some extent unwieldy, you do find many areas of this neighbor of Glendale of a significant number of rooftop air conditioners. And I can tell you, even on apartment buildings and houses, it is my suggestion that the city of Glendale don't go the route that they have gone, because those rooftop air conditioners look absolutely awful. They really are a deterioration to many neighborhoods. And in my neighborhood, we don't have that, but in very close by neighborhoods, really, those rooftop air conditioners really detract significantly both noise and the aesthetics of the neighborhoods, of the surrounding neighbors. With regard to the deposition being brought out by Myrna Stanley and Laura Friedman, I concur of the need to have further public input with regard to many of the changes that occur with regard to changes that eventually become major and drastic changes to a community. All I want to warn you is the following, that when you look at properties south of Glendale, especially properties that were built in the 1910s and 1915, 1920, which oftentimes those properties are still owned by families with not necessarily the most strong economic means, and there is termite damage. Oftentimes there is a non-compliant garage. And garages that were built originally for very, narrow automobiles, today generally would not comply. And oftentimes there would be a termite damage, and sometimes I've heard of situations where the conditions imposed on the rebuilding of it were so draconian that the actual property owner would either be faced with tearing down their whole house or attempt to fix a garage, which was the original intent. So even though the issues in other parts of Glendale, where there are larger lot sizes and larger homes and nicer neighborhoods, may require one type of additional public input, in other areas of Glendale where you find the older homes and in non-compliant or where the specifications for the other areas and garages and houses as it is, you find that there may be another type of approach to it. I'm just going from my experience in living in these parts of Glendale, where you do find these older homes with a significant amount of damage, and oftentimes the neighborhood would be faced with just simply living the old house the way it is with all the termite damage, or having to tear it down, which in both cases would have been fairly significant. So it is my hope that when you look at updating whatever zoning codes you have for this type of reconstruction, that perhaps you should do it somewhat neighborhood specific because of the different ages and the different constraints that neighborhoods have. I have another opinion as well with regard to the fences on corner lots, and I also agree with Ms. Stanley with regard to that issue. When someone does their due diligence and create the proper amount of landscaping on those corner lots with regard to how they build the fence and so forth, I've seen some neighborhoods when we went to purchase other property in Glendale a couple of years ago that we had the feeling that there were probably non-compliant additions that were made, including to the fences. And I decided to do some due diligence and check with building and safety, and sure enough, they were non-compliant. I think that there is, even for the smaller walls and fences, that perhaps there is something additionally needed, because oftentimes a buyer may go out and the real estate agent may state that everything is in compliance when it is really not, and then they're faced without their ability to be able to do something with that property. So it is my hope that in the future, perhaps some additional public input will be required. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malone. All right. We come back to the council. I'll start on my left again. Mr. Weaver.
Okay, and all this, again, revolves around the one simple question, visual. What people see and they don't like. That's what we're talking about in these areas. Let's see, I guess in the setback areas, the one that I guess I have a problem with is the 10-foot setback one. Especially when it comes to fences or whatever, or requiring the 10-foot in an R1R. I think that could be considered punitive. I mean, visually looking at R1R is mostly the hillside areas, right? Maybe justified a lot, but it does seem punitive to require 10 if you're sitting there with a 4 or 6 foot setback. Now, possibly that requires a flexibility for planning staff to make a decision based on topography, because R1R areas vary from very gentle topography to steep. So one code doesn't fit all. So I think there ought to be flexibility in the R1R, not simply prescribe 10 foot. It should say up to 10 feet. Eliminating the 4, 5, 6 row and some of the addition stuff makes sense to me, to streamline. That one thing concerns me. The rooftop equipment, does the current code say, other than on a street corner, that the equipment has to be on the rear side of the roof? Or can they put it on the front side by a current code?
Currently, rooftop equipment is not permitted in the single-family zones.
It's not permitted?
It is not permitted.
On the front, only the rear?
It's not permitted. The only way to consider rooftop equipment is to apply for an administrative exception process.
Okay. And I presume that most of the additions of air conditioning equipment on roofs are in the older homes that originally didn't have central air conditioning or anything put in. So in a remodel, they're adding air conditioning equipment on the roof. Is that fair to say?
I mean, generally speaking, yes. Those who didn't have...
On new dwelling units, is the city saying you can put your air conditioning equipment on the roof? Or do we generally say alongside the house?
In new construction, generally air conditioning is incorporated through the design review process is incorporated sometimes in the roof. So it's generally
sometimes it is permitted in the roof?
Designed into the roof, so it's not actually on the roof.
Okay, so I'm saying where it's visible probably is in the older homes that are being remodeled, having air conditioning put in, built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, so on. In those cases, I think, where it's possible, it should be on the rear side of the roof. And I don't know how they're actually built or whatever, but I presume occasionally air conditioning equipment, the same thing like mine, is going to require service. And if it is not a flexible kind where you can easily get in, that's a problem of having to remove it all. So if it's on a slope, I could see it being hinged on the upstream, on the uphill side of the roof towards the peak, door that opens and you lay back the cover so you can work on it. My engineering mind working for some reason. But even disregarding that when it's set up, it'd be oversized, but if it was camouflaged like a false brick vinyl put over it, so it looks like a large oversized chimney, or if it's colored to match the colors of the house, something to make it less obtrusive, like if you have a yellow house like with Mr. Yusefi, you don't put a purple air conditioning color on top, it kind of stands out. But somehow you make it blend in, whether it's with the roof or the house materials. I think that would help, because I know it's going to be on the older homes. The fences, I think anything over 3 feet ought to have staff looking at. That Neodrara, is that how I say it? I saw that thing too. Or Stanley had me down there looking at that a couple of years ago, and they said this remodel, the second floor was gone, and the walls were half out of the lower floor, and they called it a remodel. I was just as frustrated as people in Verdugo Woodlands were that couldn't be stopped. As far as I know, as we all know, you sell a house, you get a termite inspection. What are they looking at if they're not discovering termites that they're not going to eat away a house in a few years? Either you're getting lousy termite inspection reports, and I don't know what the standards for review on those are, but to then come up with it later and say you found it and then tear down 90% of the house, I think it's wrong. I think we have to have some review standards on those. If it's going to be over 50%, the very least, staff ought to be looking at it and their decision whether it goes to design review, because that's a monstrosity that was built there under the guise of being a remodel, and that just should not happen. I know I had another house that I helped on. They tore down the walls, then they found termites, and it took them slightly over the 50%. The city put a stop work order on it. They had the 4-foot setback, it had to be 6 foot. So they would have had to remove the foundation wall and move it in 2 feet. I think they applied for a variance and eventually got it. But to change the footprint of the existing house, I think is wrong. It's one thing if you're going to remodel by less than 50%, add a whole second story, that's a different condition. But where it's 1 story or something and it's 4, I say you're grandfathered. Shouldn't necessarily have to pull it into 6. You're driving the cost up considerably to the homeowner. 50% rule, I'm totally sick of it. I simply do not know how you determine it adequately. I've seen so many homes, even up in Glen Oaks Canyon, that are supposedly remodels, or less than 50% rule, and there's nothing left. So it's either abuse, or I simply don't know what 50% removal means. That's a whole other issue that we're not going to tackle here. But discover the termites. Yeah, I think even if it's less than 50%, staff ought to be looking at it, making a determination whether it ought to go to design review. In an existing neighborhood, you shouldn't be allowed to just simply change the architectural design of the house under the guise of this is a remodel. Because you saw that one. It's not a remodel. That's a new house from top to bottom. Are those did I cover the areas that you wanted to hear?
Are you asking me, or are you joking, Mr. Weaver?
Staff. Was there any other?
Could someone over at that end nod or shake their head or something?
No comment on the rest.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Quintero.
Okay, I'll start with the termite issue. And it's an issue that has been going on all over Southern California in established neighborhoods. Whenever you have an established neighborhood, this is the way to get around, whether they're local design review codes or whether you don't want to change the setback. So it's an old scam, if you want to call it that. And there happens to be an Academy Award winning actress who did something similar to Nayo Dara that I'm familiar with. And she got away with it, actually. She absolutely got away with it, to the dismay of all of her neighbors. This is in another city.
I was getting excited there.
Not in Glendale. It was another. It was in another city.
The award-winning actress in our midst.
I'll give you the name off camera. But anyway, and I did follow that saga once I was informed as to what was going on, and it was just beyond belief. I also inquired with the staff as to what was possible and what wasn't possible, and we were sort of caught behind the 8 ball on this one. So I think we need to do everything we can to not let something like this take place, because it's just absolutely too easy to do it, the way the code is currently set up and the way our procedures are. So one of the things that comes to mind is when you talk about a termite report, there are different degrees, different levels of termite reports. So I would put it on the applicant to put together a termite report that in a sense will protect the applicant. In other words, an extensive termite report so that so they know up front going into that project what it is that that house is like. And so I think that's one way to avoid, oh, gee, I didn't know, and this came up, I didn't know anything about it, neither did the architect, neither did the contractor, etc. Set it up so that the applicant right up front is knowledgeable about what his or her house is like. I think that'll sort of close that door. Then as for the percentage, I mean, who came up with 50%? Why not lower that percentage to 40%? So anyway, I just think there's different ways to go about setting this up so that we don't run into another situation like Mr. Weaver said. Basically, they built a new home. They built a home that didn't conform to the rest of the neighborhood. They built a home that was absolutely nothing like the home that they replaced. So we have to tighten up, or otherwise it's going to continue to happen. Then one of the speakers talked about in the southern portion of the city and so forth, and that is a good point. But the difference is, most of the time in the southern portion of the city, they're really not adding on. They want to redo a garage, or they want to make some small little square footage addition, or add a bathroom, etc. So I think that is a totally different story than what's taking place in other neighborhoods in Glendale, where obviously the idea is to build as large a home as possible and not comply with the new code. So I think we can differentiate between the two. But overall, I'm for closing this possibility so that we don't have issues like what took place there in the Verdugo Woodlands and in other sections of the city. In terms of the enclosures, I think we can do a better job of trying to do something on air conditioning on rooftops that are a little less unsightly. And I would leave it up to the staff, but it's hard to believe that some of these pictures, though if you've seen them, some of these pictures passed. I mean, I just don't see how that crate, that one particular home, I mean, it literally, there's a crate sitting on top of the house. I don't know why the homeowner would want to do it, number one, but number two, we've got to tighten that up quite a bit. The walls and fences, absolutely. The fence, that wrought iron fence with the metal clad behind it and the screening behind it, that is just horrible. And I know our neighborhood services was working on that house. I don't know what the final outcome was, but I know the neighbors were very concerned. I drove by the house myself, and it was really just horrible. You could literally see it up and down the block, but especially as you drove up. And the same with the side, that side fence. I mean, we've got to come up with a better set of codes so people living in corner houses aren't allowed to do that. I mean, that just ruins it for everyone else on that street as you face the front of this particular house, it's fine, but the rest of the neighborhood has to suffer with this block walls. Then in terms of the setback in the R1R zones, I want to do whatever we can do to discourage second floor additions in hillsides. So whatever we can do, if people want to add on to their homes, I'm fine with that, but we need to come up with codes and guidelines that are going to keep people in hillside areas from building the second homes. Most homes in hillside areas are single story, and that's where we run into most of our issues on or we have in the past, on a continuing basis. So whatever we can do, I'm ready to support it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Quintero. Mr. Najarian.
I'm going to yield my time to the gentleman from Glen Oaks Canyon, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, Mr. Weaver, you mean? Oh, Mr.
The gentleman from Glen Oaks.
You realize we have bookends. We have bookends from
That's right.
Glen Oaks Canyon. Mr. Youssef.
The one who does not have a purple anything on top of his yellow house. I just want to make that very clear. Number one, let me go one thing at a time. The order that you represented this and the order the staff report is written is a little bit different. So I'm going to go by this. If you looked at the pictures of the air conditioners, with the exception of one of them, most of these things were probably put in the 80s. These are package units. That means they're heating and air conditioning. That's why they just plop them on the top. It was cheap to do. Almost every single one of these houses could have had a split air conditioning unit. They all have they have a crawl space underneath, which you could put your heater, or you could put your heater in your attic. You could have your vents from the top, or you could have your vents from the bottom, and you could put your compressor unit on the back of the house, and you don't have to see it. One of the reasons I object to this is the '94 earthquake. I was doing roof repairs left and right, and most houses that had air conditioners sitting on top of their roofs did the most damage to those roofs because it just moves like crazy and the momentum doesn't stop after the house has stopped. It broke all kinds of rafters, and some of them came right through. Actually, one came through and landed on somebody's sofa. Thank God that person wasn't sitting. So I have an issue with all of these, and no matter how you design this, you can't make it look good, because building and safety requires that you have a walkway path around this unit, a 36-inch in front of it, so a repairman can stand on that while they're working on the unit. So it's not just the unit alone. By the time you build all this ancillary stuff that the building and safety wants, you have this behemoth sitting on top of the roof. That's why I say status quo. The only time I think we need to allow this type of units are when you have a house who has a flat roof and it's sitting on a concrete slab. Those are the only ones that there is no other way to do that, and I think the way the zoning administrator has that, maybe that should be one of the requirements. Whether it's in the back, it's on the side, it's horrible. So that's one thing that I am very adamant about that having. The second item in here is walls and fences. This is walls and fences that are not in the front setbacks. I will tell you one thing what we should do is, which I think we can do, is to modify our building code to require permits for walls that are over 4 feet. Do you know how I found out that my property, where the right-of-way on my property was? Because I had to go pull a permit for my 4-foot fence. That's how I found out about where the right-of-ways are in Glen Oaks Boulevard. If I hadn't gone there, I would have never known. I think anything less over 3 foot, even if it's not on your front setback, you should go and get a permit from building and safety, because I've seen walls built that you would look at that and I go, I don't think 5 miles an hour wind is going to hold up this thing. It's going to collapse. And on top of that, I think you should go to staff. Staff can take a look at it. If you think it kind of blends with the house, fine. If it's not, then goes to DRB, because I've seen what it looks like. You gentlemen remember that other wall that came to us that was, what was it, 7 feet, 10 feet, 9 feet tall on a little cul-de-sac that it just kind of came out? So that's where I stand on those walls and fences. I have no problem. In my opinion, this should be dealt with only on the front setbacks that is seen from the streets. Side setbacks, like the picture that you showed, I don't have a problem with this. My understanding was in the past we required landscaping in here. I don't know if the code has changed, but we don't require landscaping anymore. But we used to require that at the time that we dealt with the walls and fences a while back. So the next item is the 456 rule. I was around, and so was Kraus, when we dealt with 456 rules during the anti-mansionization ordinance. There is a reason why we kept it the way we kept it. This was done to basically allow some people to be able to add to their house without doing this major modification and forcing them to go up. So I would like to continue keeping that. As I read the staff's recommendation, the first thing that says, the rule is complex. I don't think it's that complex. It's pretty much simple. It says what it is. 4, 5, 6, that's it, existing. You can add to it, keep it the same, so this doesn't look horrible. Now, you may want to put a limit as the length of that extension. So say length of extension is 6 feet. So this way, if you're adding to the interior part of that bedroom, you want to extend that bedroom, it doesn't have that weird notch in it. And I agree with Mr. Quintero, with some of the R1R areas, if you do that, then you're pushing these guys up. And I don't know if that's a good thing. As far as the 50% rule is concerned, for some of my friends out there who think that termite can't eat a house in 2 years, I took a deck down that was built in 2 years, and within 2 years, 1,000 square foot redwood deck had to be completely replaced because it was all eaten by termites. And I was shocked because I thought redwoods, I was under the impression that termites don't eat redwoods. Well, I found out that if they're hungry enough, they'll eat anything. It doesn't matter whether it's redwood or not. So in 2 years, they went through it, and they were still live while I was getting rid of it. My only concern with that 50% law is this. I think we need to keep what the zoning administrator is doing, but I like what the Northwest Glendale suggested, which is if you're going to replace over 50%, you have to not remove it, get what we're doing currently, go and show a proof to the zoning administrator, get a verification from the staff, which means I want a staff person going there and seeing it with their own eyes, not just bring me a letter from a termite company, because you know what, I can get you anything you want from a termite company. You just pay them, they'll write you whatever report you want. So reports don't mean anything to me because I've seen it done. Go down, verify it, and if it is more than 50%, the replacement needs to be consistent with the house that he is tearing down. So I have no problem. Termite eats your house. You want to tear it down, you want to rebuild it, rebuild it. But after you're done, that bloody house better look just like the one you tore down. Okay? Not like a mansion or a castle. So that's where I stand on all those 4 items, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yusefian. Mr. Weaver, you had a couple more comments, and then I'll go to mine.
again, what I said on the fences, I think it ought to be 3 feet. Even with 3 feet, you get to 4 feet, it can begin to be very ugly if it's not done properly. And that's why I say 3 feet in the setback or beyond the setback. Too high. It can be ugly. So require planning staff review. Now, I understand how can you enforce. A lot of it is going to be complaint driven by neighbors that see it. If they call in, I'm tired of this thing, well, it's already there, so forgive me and let me continue. No, make it mandatory. If you've done that, say, well, I didn't know about the code or anything, well, too bad. Make them tear it down and do it the right way. And that's when there's complaints that come in. There's one up in Glenmore that we saw, totally ugly, but it fit the code, so they went along with it. And the only other thing, the air conditioning, on my 71 house, the heating is inside the house, and the air conditioning unit is outside the house. It costs more to do it that way, but if you have attic space, then staff ought to be really forcing or trying to make people do that. Whether we have to legislate it, I don't know. Putting on the top, yes, structurally, if you require them going through and getting a structural design review so it is stable in an earthquake sitting on the roof, that's something else. But I don't think we require that right now. They just get a permit for an air conditioner.
No, we just say no. You can't put it on. Right now, today, you can't get it on.
You're out of order.
On the existing, on the rear, anything?
Right.
And if we
I'll be fast.
I thought we do give permission to it.
All right.
How are these going up there then?
All right. Let's get an answer to Mr. Weaver's question. And
Yeah. How do these get up there then? If we don't permit it.
Relief to this requirement is applying for an administrative exception process.
Which you grant. But do you require any kind of structural review?
When they pull their building permit, building and safety would look at that.
So therefore, it can't come down because building and safety's looked at it, right, Mr. Yusefia? Yeah.
Okay.
So presumably.
All right, Mr. Najarian.
Thank you. Let me start with the termites.
But I thought you yielded your time.
I did. I didn't think he was going to take all that.
Really?
How long you've known me?
Okay.
I used to have a 1,000-square-foot redwood deck. One day the contractor came by and said, I didn't think the termites ate this stuff.
So you were there.
Tore it all out. Okay, let me start with the roof-mounted air conditioners and accessory heating equipment. They are just pretty ugly no matter how they're screened. There's very few ways to do them tastefully, so whatever steps would be necessary to phase these out, leaving, of course, some sort of review for those cases where there is no other reasonable way to place them for the homeowner. I'm in favor of getting rid of those. The walls and fences, I think in some of these pictures you really see that they do become a structural component of the house. Not structural, but visible and aesthetic component. And if we're going to put a home through strict scrutiny at the DRB and let them put up this awful-looking fence, I think we're defeating the purpose. So anything that's going to either put some pre-approved designs or put these through a design review process, I'm in favor of. Let's see, the 50% rule. I think that really is it's really a sad story, that Neodara property, especially since they had intended all along to build this type of house. It was denied, and then, oops, guess what? We got termites. Here's our loophole. So I think if there's anything, I think Mr. Weaver put forth that notion that unless it's being built in duplication or significantly consistent with what previously was there, that it should go to a design review. I don't like the idea that just because there's termites that there's a huge loophole for the owner and developer to build whatever they see fit. With regard to the 546 setbacks, I also want to do everything we can. I'm glad that Franco Naravian came by. I know you do a lot of this work. I see your name all over. What we don't want to do is force the homeowners to go up. I think that's much more intrusive and disruptive to a neighborhood than maintaining those 5-foot or 4-foot side setbacks. So I'm in favor of keeping that with the intention of not forcing anyone who wants an addition to go up, and keep it on one level. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Najarian. Well, yes, Mr.
I'd just like to let you know, forewarn you that we still have other stuff in here, so.
I'm well aware. So now you're cautioning me to be brief?
No. I
Boy,
just want to let you know.
Boy, is that a role reversal?
No, I just want to let you know that I'm going to have more items to go through after.
Oh, I don't.
You have had yours.
Believe me, I've been here almost 2 years. And I've been in this city my whole life and out there for years. So I know. I assume you're going to have more to say, Mr. Yusefian. I just won't fall for the gag of yielding time to you again. All right. Ms. Asp, you can put your pen down as far as my comments, because they're more in the form of rhetoric than they are direction to staff. As I look at this, I'm keep running the gamut of emotions from annoyed to dismayed to startled to I don't know what, and incredulous. There's another one to add to it, because I hear some of the input from my colleagues that a lot of it stops short of what the answer is going to be. You know, we need to do something about this. Anything we can do to help solve this. Well, that's what the discussion is supposed to be about. What is the solution going to be? Yeah, we all know. This picture, as an example, on the front page of this packet with this air conditioning screen around it, is a total abomination. Let's call it what it is. It is ugly as can be. It's an abomination of that neighborhood. And I don't care whether it's South Glendale, North Glendale, if it's in my backyard or your backyard. I know from looking at it, it's not in any of your backyards. And what concerns me is we just say, well, you know, I'm content as long as staff looks at it. Well, staff looked at it. Look at it. It's terrible. It's awful. Mr. Yusefian said it. Mr. Najarian said it. Mr. Weaver said it. Mr. Quintero said it. But then to turn around and say, so, you know, just whatever staff can do to make sure we don't have that. Well, that's how we got it. So we asked the question, well, one of the suggestions is more information for the current process. Not more information, far more information. The fact that we would even approve something like that with an administrative exception, it's just, I mean, if I were in a neighborhood, that would be outrageous. What we can do. Sometimes, I have to say, I wonder who the devil, as a city government, we are advocating for, because, you know, we say this isn't working, so the people who approved it just do better. What is that? That's not direction. Then I agree with Mr. Yusefian with a lot of his points, but he makes a comment, that bloody house better look like it did originally. You're right. Or what? Mr. Howard, Mr. Garcia, we going to get a demolition order from the court? Yeah. Is the state of California going to let us do that? They're going to overrule us when they go to court? No. Yeah, they will overrule us, according to you. We had a meeting about this just the other day about the house on Endinas, correct? Basically, a whole new house was built without any permits. And it went on and on and on. Where I picked it up was in 2004. Now we're in 2009. 5 years went by. We have a whole different house there. And it was taken right up to the point of requesting a demolition order. Never happened. And according to our legal experts, it won't happen, probably because we're not going to be backed up on that in the courts. So who are we advocating for? So anyway, that's my answer is, or what? Well, we're going to make it look like it did originally, and once it's built, if it doesn't, then what? We got one. What are we doing about it? Here's the one on near Drara. So what are we doing? You getting a demolition order for it? Nope. Okay. Let's see. Mr. Hagani, could you please come forward? I want to read you a statement. Please tell me what is incorrect about this statement. It's not a trick question. I don't think it is incorrect, but I want to know what, if anything, is. This is the email to Kristen Asp from Mr. Fouad from Northwest Homeowners. What is troubling is that there doesn't seem to be any requirement to go in front of DRB or revisiting zoning issues if the new house doesn't resemble the old. See, that's again what Mr. Yusefian is referring to. This is clearly true when more than 50% of the house is rebuilt, but equally applies if less than 50% is rebuilt. Currently, it's basically up to the zoning administrator to decide, and in this particular case, near Drara, the new house is very different from the last.
What is incorrect about that is there's no incorrection, and I'm sorry, can I answer that? Right
Yeah,
now?
I just meant with the assumption.
There is a lack of information there. In fact, the case planner in this case, who is not working under the direction of the zoning administrator, double-checked, based on the latest complaint, the design that is being built against that which was approved, which was exempt from the design review board review, and found out that in fact the design is completely different. And the new, again, the latest stop work order in this case was based on the fact that the applicant did not follow the design for which the zoning administrator had initially exempted them from design review board. So that is a lack of information on Mr. on the person who wrote on Mr. Fouad's part. And there's this other piece that they do not. We have completely changed the system now that the case planners actually follow up on these issues. The 50% rule information is correct. I'm sorry. I think I answered your question in that case.
Okay.
So what's incorrect is that yes, a stop work order has been issued because the design is not consistent with the permit that was issued.
Well, we got a house sitting there.
That's accurate.
So what? No, wait a minute. So what did the stop work order accomplish?
We don't know yet. And that
well, let me make a suggestion.
Yes.
You may not know yet. I got a good idea. There's a house there that is not at all like the house that was there. Anybody else notice that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to me, the stop work order didn't do a lot, and the follow-up didn't do a lot. The case planner following up. All right.
Mr. Mayor, could you please continue on that, because you're leaving me hanging out there.
No, I'm getting
I
to
still want
something.
to know what happens to that house.
Something I'm getting to is just that what I'm not getting in this report is how we're going to deal with these issues. And what I'm getting at is here are the concerns. We know the concerns. I can keep restating back to you the concerns. We can see them, you can see them, the folks at home can see them. What I'm not getting is recommendations. And so anyway, let me go. That was I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Mr.
I am willing to give you a recommendation.
Thank you.
Our staff's recommendation is to formally remove termite damage as part of a natural disaster and make it very clear that termite damage prior or after the demolition has started will not be considered as a natural damage, and the case will be subject to full review and to new standards. That is staff's recommendation. The zoning administrator has in occasions been in a situation where she has had to consider these things, and that has put her in a very difficult spot. We think we can remove that difficulty by making it really clear and clarifying it in the zoning code.
Here's the perception.
Yes.
Okay. The perception is, and you say it puts the zoning administrator in a bad position. I agree with you. The perception is that the zoning administrator and all of you, staff sitting here, almost become complicit in gaming the code. That's what it appears to be. That's what it appears to be. The 50% rule is used to game the code. Ms. Stanley said, well, the zoning administrator was going along with the code. Well, yes, but at what point did any of you say to yourself, you know what, this smells wrong? And I'll bet the answer is very early on. Mr. Weaver went out there. He saw it. He said, this doesn't make any sense. Mr. Yusefian, Mr. Najarian, Mr. Quintero, and we're coming to the process later than all of you. And I know for a fact that you all were looking at this and going, the system's being gamed. I'd be right with you, Mr. City Manager. The administrative exceptions, in my view, are being used to game the system as well. With regard to walls and fences, I think the walls and fences, particularly when they are facing the street or largely visible to a neighbor, they're integral to the design of the property. So why wouldn't they be part of design review? And plus the notion of standards and codes for walls and fences that face the street or are largely visible. I also agree with the 4-foot issue that Mr. Yusefian raised, and several others have raised as well. Let's see if there was anything else here. Largely, I think if you took a survey of people that live in Glendale and even people who work in the construction trade outside of Glendale who do some work in Glendale and said, is Glendale an easy place to build or difficult place to build or do remodeling? I'm not sure what you think, but I think they would overwhelmingly say it's a very difficult place to work. I don't know anybody in the construction trade that tells me, oh, Glendale's an easy place to do work. Now, I hear the exact opposite. And yet, it seems like these issues, these problems that have been presented here and others that we hear, like Andinas, Niobrara, even some of the commercial projects, like that abomination on Ocean View Boulevard, 3500 Ocean View Boulevard, which again was the same technique, happens to be a commercial area, same technique. Well, we want to put a new roof on the building. Oh, wait, there's damage there. Suddenly we've got a crane in there bringing in steel trusses, and suddenly we have a second-story steel truss suspension roof going on. And nobody seems to believe that until the neighbors come with a photograph to council. Anyway, somehow it's difficult if you go through the process. If you don't, and you want to game the system, then something else happens. Somehow it becomes easy then to do this. To do this. To do this. You all want to live next door to that?
Well, thank you.
I wouldn't. I would see that as an assault on my property values, is what I would see. Anyway, well, I warned you it was all rhetoric and not much direction.
You want direction?
I think that's what we need. I think we need more answers to how we will solve the problems for the people who are just determined to gain the system. And we keep saying we don't want to make undue hardship for people to not destroy each other's property values. Maybe we do. Maybe we have to take those steps. Mr. Yusefian's talking about, a split package. Well, that's a little more expensive. Maybe we have to require that.
It's required now.
But it's not. See?
Those are, Mr. Mayor, those were illegally installed.
I understand
and
that.
They went back, and the city tried to give them a break and told them put things around it.
But that's the point.
So my thing is, I've always been under an assumption that if you do something illegal, the city nails you. I don't know why we're not doing that.
I'll come back to you in a moment. That's exactly the point, Mr. Yusefian. if there's no follow-through, if we give these kinds of exceptions or we give the people who are gaming the system the break, then we don't have a system.
I agree.
All right.
When you're ready.
Mr. Weaver, I'm ready.
Okay, one, yeah, the system is being gamed. It's been gamed for as long as I can remember. People do things, and then we give them permission after the fact. And it's very well known out there in the community, so they continue to do it until we put a stop to it. Even though it's expensive to them, they can't play dumb. We have to say no. It comes off, it goes out, whatever, to restore and do it the right way. If you want ideas, okay, then like Mr. Yosefian said, heating and air in the attics. Only time you can't is when it's a flat roof. They can put inside, that's more cost, but that takes care of the problem on the roof. We can change the code to say that, right? Put the heating inside there, that's where mine is, inside. So you can open up sidewall, you have to take off part of the roof and you stick it in there. You put the compressor, whatever, outside. Remodeling, 50%, forget the 50% rule. If it's a remodel, then it goes to planning. And you all decide if it needs to go design review under the direction or codified that it's got to look like the house that was there. Same architectural style. You can't go off on a tangent somewhere. Fences, well, I still say 3 foot. You get about 3 foot, give me a break. You can make an abomination at 4 foot tall. And even that, 3 foot, planning review. You decide if it has to go design review, as Mr. Draymond said. It's got to look like the character house. It can't be some foreign kind of object thing. You can't have wrought-on rails going clear up in the air that's totally foreign. That's abomination, too. And I think you said it correctly now. The inspectors that go out are now checking with the case planner to make sure that what is being built is in conform with the architectural design that planning has approved. So supposedly that link has been corrected. Now, those are more costly, maybe more time consuming. If you want to eliminate the problem, that's one thing. I don't know how you codify, put into law. If you see something, even if it's 95% complete and it doesn't fit the rules, it's coming back out at the homeowner's expense. You can't play dumb. You can't go out and hire an attorney and demand your rights. It comes out. Can we do that? Can we?
No, you can't once they've gotten a permit?
But if they put in, it doesn't match what it's supposed to be.
Once they've gotten a permit and they've started construction, it becomes more problematic.
And if they've done it illegally, we can demand it.
Done illegally, yes. And that kind of begs the question, though, when you start using language like has to be duplicate. I think, frankly, that you run into an enforcement problem there.
Same architectural style.
And I hear from council members, same architectural style, consistency, duplicate. And I think, frankly, you run into, Councilman Weaver, an enforcement issue as far as what is. And what I'm hearing from other council members is, frankly, you should require a process at the beginning to determine whether or not it's consistent or it's duplicate.
I don't care.
So that's really the policy call for the council.
Give us the wording.
Let me go to the city manager. He's had his hand up for a while. I'm sorry.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I was going to suggest that I think the kind of conversation you're having and the feedback we're getting on these 4 areas will help us begin to tighten up whether it's code or it's administrative policy in the way we address issues. When we get a clear sense from the city council, let's take the matter of the rooftop air conditioning units. The staff has had a particular mindset relative to that. If somebody comes in and says, well, it's hard, I don't have space, it's going to be expensive, the staff has generally granted exceptions and said screen it, and frankly, we haven't given a lot of attention to the quality of the screening. It's very clear. We need to change our practice. The code says thou shalt not have rooftop units. As Mr. Yosefian points out, there is another way to get air conditioning and heating that you don't have to mount it on your roof. It's more expensive. There is different equipment available. The staff will, because the code doesn't allow it, and you can only get it through administrative exception. We now have, I think, a good understanding of how firm you want us to be relative to granting exceptions or allowing any waivers on the code's prohibition. And that is, you're going to have to go a long way to convince us you can't otherwise fill that need before we grant you an exception to put it on the roof. So I think we can come back to you in all 4 of these areas because, frankly, you've given us very good feedback. and I think across the board, pretty consistent feedback on your feeling on these 4 major areas. I don't think we're ready for the ordinance tonight.
If I may review what at least the direction is that I think, we may or may not be ready for the ordinance tonight, but I'd like to wrap it up so we could bring in the language the next time around.
Okay.
If I may?
Well, let's hear from, just one second, let's hear from the rest of the council members that want to weigh in before you wrap it up. Mr. Quintero will work this way.
The planning director, his staff recommendation, what he said just a few moments ago, that will nip the termite issue in the bud. I mean, that will be it. That will be it. So I support that recommendation.
Okay. Mr. Najarian. Yield your time, yes, sir.
I just wanted to... But Mr. Mayor, I share your frustration in the enforcement options that we have as a city. And what I'd like to know is what we can do, perhaps with the city attorney's office. And you answered a little bit with Mr. Weaver's question. I'd like to have a better understanding. I know that we've made certain property owners lop off sections of their roof before. I mean, this was a sad history in Glendale building, and what I'd like to know is what the current state of the law is. If someone builds something that's not according to the plans, or this isn't a remodel, hey, this is a complete redo, what our options are, as opposed to just the, stop that, stop work. In the meantime, it's up there, and they get to continue to work the system or work the councilman or whatever, whatever they could work their congressman, work their state assemblyman. But I think what we need overriding all of these issues is a clear understanding as to where council can go when we see that someone has gamed the system, gamed the codes, overstepped their rights with regard to their building permit, their design, etc. And I'm talking about tearing stuff down. So request for information as to where the current state of the law is and current municipal policy.
Mr. City Manager.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I'll let the city attorney respond to the state of the law, but as you know, Mr. Mayor, we did have a rather lengthy conversation just last week over a subject property. That's a very good example of how I think in an effort to do the right thing, we allow ourselves to be gamed. And in the process, then the city and the staff and everybody loses credibility in that. The conclusion that we came to is with clear sentiment from the city council, we, the staff, need to change the way we coordinate our efforts when we respond to these issues when they first come to our attention. As an example, in a case in particular where it had drug on a great while, we'd gotten to the point of having city attorney enforcement and we're in court. We sat down with the property owner and we said, you have 3 options. Take it out, and we'd already gotten to the point of having an order in court backed up and putting a person on probation, as I recall. We said, take it out, or submit plans to correct back to us again to modify it. I forget what the third option was, but essentially it was correct the problem.
That's right.
Following a philosophy that our intention from a code enforcement standpoint isn't to penalize, but is to get people to comply. In this case, we've been working on this for 3 years or 3.5 years. When we finally got to the point that we'd gotten the property owner's attention good enough, in fact, we had the foot of the court and the city attorney's office on his neck, and at that point, we're giving options of submit your applications to bring your property into conformance, which kind of conveys to the public he's being allowed to game the system. Because suddenly they have to go back through the whole process then of us accepting applications, going through a design review process for work that was illegal from the very day. We were deceived. He continued to game the system, and it appeared to the public that we were now somehow going to let him walk in the front door now with applications and legitimize all of this. What we could have done at that point, and the court might not have agreed, but we could have said, you know what, you now have one option. Tear it all down. Then you can have his attorney go into court and convince a judge that we shouldn't be allowed to do that. But our conclusion in this case was, you know what, back when we were trying to get compliance as opposed to punishment. We should have said, you know what, this one has become so egregious that we're not going to be cooperative. We're not going to seek compliance. Frankly, we're going to go into court and tell them, you've got one option, tear it down. If you don't like that option, sue us, take us to court, have the judge tell us we're wrong. And that's the conclusion we came to in that case. I think what that means is all of these policies will be helpful at the front end in determining how to administer these various policies, but we also need to, at some point, from code enforcement, city attorney's office, planning, my office, at some point somebody has to say, you know what, it's time for us to quit being gamed in the process because we're being gamed. And once we get to that conclusion, knowing the council is going to be supportive and the staff saying, enough is enough, you know, take it out, tear it down. We're no longer going to be the nice guy in this case because you've taken advantage of us. They'll go into court and tell the judge because we're not listening anymore. And hopefully then prevent these cases, I think, are few and far between that get as far as what was a recent case, the
Endinas.
Endinas. Yeah, the Endinas house. That don't get that far where we're 4 years down the road. Then all the public sees is now the owner gets to go through the process and try and get everything he's done illegally legitimized and permitted.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
If I may go over what I think I hear this.
You have two more colleagues that want to weigh in. Mr. Okay. Mr. Yusefian.
I think, Mr. Mayor, we need to take one of these cases to court. Even if we lose, we need to appeal it to a higher authority and take it all the way. Because I think at one point, some judge, whether it's in the Supreme Court of the state of California or the Supreme Court of the United States, going to have to make a decision. Do municipalities and their codes and standards actually mean something, or it's just a game of whoever is able to just drag this on longer and longer? Now, my understanding was last time with one project called Altavar, we took him to court, and Mr. Cardew had to spend over $1 million bringing up that project to standards. So I don't understand why on Niagara we didn't do that, or on this other one we didn't do that. When you say to someone, stop work, but gee, if you turn in an application, I will modify this to what you have already built, you know what? There's no reason for me to go for a permit. Because for the same exact reason that Mr. Draymond says, in this city, every contractor knows it's a tough city to do business in. It's also known forgiveness is much easily attained than permission. That's a true fact. I will not lie to you. I will tell that to anyone. And that's why we see all kinds of work that goes on. Mr. Weaver, as you drive home tonight, look at the 2200 block. On your left-hand side, you will see somebody's putting a circular driveway on a property that is less than 50 feet frontage, which is not allowed.
Yep.
They're putting it in.
I'm looking at it. I haven't gone over the planning yet.
And most of the brickwork is in. There's barely any sidewalks left, any landscaping left. Would that one come out? Probably not. And that's the problem. So we could put, and I share your frustration, whatever we do in here, it's not enough. And on this last one, as Mr. Hagani, you said, let's eliminate the termite. How does this make any difference on this guy? It doesn't make any difference. Because whether or not it was termite or not termite, he built this anyway. And he did not follow what the zoning administrator said you should do. They're two completely different houses. And still standing. You haven't tore it down. Where's that bulldozer? And so I don't think the issue in here is the termite business. Because you could change all the laws in the world, and if you don't enforce them, they're worthless. So on the air conditioning issues, in my opinion, you should not have any kind of a surround put on any of these new units. They're much smaller, much more compact. They're not as ugly, but they should be allowed only, and I mean that clearly, only when a house has flat roof, no attic space, and no basement. It means it is sitting on a slab floor. That's the only time you should consider that, and you can work out some kind of a deal with that. But the rest of the stuff, as a matter of fact, that one that looked like a crate, maybe we can send somebody out there to take those pieces of wood down. It looks, I mean, that is a horrible looking thing. It's just like a fire hazard to begin with. And 3 foot, I think we all have agreed on 3 foot.
3 foot what?
For this front wall.
On the front.
If it's
Front setback.
Right.
Area.
Yeah.
And one question from any of the attorneys. Can we change the building code to require a permit?
I believe so, yes, because it's an administrative rule as opposed to development standard.
Okay, because the staff says they will not know about any of these things unless there's a permit required.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to do them together.
2 things on that. One, that would be a separate process from this because this was all noticed as part of the changes to the zoning code. And second, I believe that obviously the building official will want to speak to that as well when that does, if that comes back, if the council wants to hear that item.
If I can, on that point, however, without requiring a building permit, though, you could require a permit. For example, any fence that wouldn't otherwise be subject to a building permit. It could be a planning permit that would be required.
Yeah.
And that way, you could even give a free permit for a fence, for example, under 5 feet, as long as it's subject to materials, and you give somebody an informational sheet and all of that. So there are ways communities have addressed that without having to be subject to a building permit.
The message is the same.
Yeah,
it's the desire to bring this into a permit process. Mr. Hagani, Mr. Weaver has a comment, and I realize there's one prong I didn't weigh in on. It's just brief. It's to agree with something that another councilman
I agree
said.
too. What I'm hearing from my colleagues is you either do it or you remove it. We're going to toughen up. I guess that's a philosophical point. Whatever. Blast it. You tie it up in commercial and retail too. Because we have been gamed time and time again in commercial retail areas, one less than a block from here. And I know all the details on that sucker. And it got through. They did it illegally, and it got through the system because of pressure that was put on in our office to make it happen. Now it's all legal and in. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. If you're going to toughen up on residential, you toughen up on everything. Send the message loud and clear to the community. We're not going to tolerate people doing things illegally and then getting it okayed after the fact because of pressures put on by certain people in this city. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Absolutely. On the 456 issue, I didn't weigh in on that. I just wanted to say that I also agree with at least 2 or 3 other of my colleagues who made the point that to the extent that that forces development to go up, I would rather see the narrower, the shorter setback than that. So I left that out. I wanted to add to that. All right, Mr. Hagani, after all the red meat waving, I apologize, but, you know, sometimes we get so far adrift from some of the reasons that some of us even ran for office in the first place. A lot of these are the issues that propelled a lot of us to go out and run for office in the first place. It's sort of like, you know, waving a red cape in front of an old bull that is saying, oh, yeah, that's what this is all about. And this is a chance that we can actually try to tighten some of that up. All right.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And just by the way, it's good for us to know how much support we have in being strict because, for example, the roof top equipment has been dubbed the planning department's roof tax by many because they think it's an unnecessary permit that the planning department and planning staff are interested in. It's good for us to come here and confirm and hear the confirmation from the city council that we have the backing of the city council to stand firm. So here's what I've heard. I think we have a consensus with these regards. Rooftop equipment, consider requiring a split system and looking at other options. If there is no flat roof, for example, if there is an attic space, a basement area, or sufficient crawling space where the equipment could be added to, and only then, if necessary, go through the the administrative review process and be rigorous in the review process. More rigorous, not less rigorous than the past. On walls and fences, we hear a consensus that anything higher than 3 feet should be subject to review, at a minimum by having planning and design standards, and hopefully by maybe amending the building code to require building permits again, this time for walls and fences higher than 3 feet. That would actually help us to catch them prior to them becoming a code enforcement issue.
For what he said,
That's right.
which is a zoning permit.
And if I can, I think you have two different types of fences. Those in the front yard setback area
That's
that
what
are
we're
going to be more visible. Then you have the interior fences that may be property line fences, and you could treat them differently.
Right.
Should talk about visibility, because sometimes the side
Right.
and the back can
Exactly.
also
No,
be
this-
visible.
They can too.
I think we were talking about the front ones at the street.
That's
So 3 feet on the front, the sides are current code, that's fine. I don't have a problem with
Front
that.
setback or out of the.
Well, I suggest, let us review side yard as well, because, for example, we have no height limit on side yard. So even though
There used to be an 8 foot before,
No.
I mean 6 foot before.
No, now over 6 foot, you have to get a building permit, but we should revisit the whole area.
Revisit it
Yeah.
and bring us back some
We will.
options.
I think
Thank
we have a
you.
sense of the council.
And then regarding the 50% rule, I believe I'm hearing a desire to remove the termite damage as an option for allowing to go beyond 50%. In other words, we can clearly state that in the code and say that termite damage and other kinds of damage that have been considered in the past will not be considered as part of the 50%, going beyond the 50%. And then regarding the 456 rule, we hear the consensus to keep it status quo the way it is at this point, because there is really no better option to limit it if we
Mr.
wanted
City
to.
Manager.
Yeah, on the 50% rule, I mean, I'm hearing a couple of different issues, and I think we need to probably, among staff, figure out how to address them. One is, at what point do you lose any pre-existing non-conforming benefits you may have? The other is, even though you may not be losing any pre-existing non-conforming benefits, you may be significantly altering the look of the home, so it may still have to go back to the design review board. I mean, I hear concern about both of those things, but in particular, even though they may meet the standard, if they're significantly changing the exterior of the house and it's inconsistent with the neighborhood, then in spite of having the continued benefits of pre-existing non-conforming, may still need to go back to design review.
Yes.
That concept's already in the code, right,
That's
Mr.
right.
Ghani?
It's not in the code, but it was.
Well, if I'm reading you
We'll
right,
look
we just
at
need to
it.
make
We'll
sure
look
that's
at
being
it.
addressed.
Yes.
But since we brought in the exemption staff report and you gave us the direction to make sure that everything that requires to go to the design review board, including things that change the architectural character,
Okay.
we've been implementing that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yes, Mr. Yusefi.
On the 50, just to let you know where I come from on the 50% rule. If they go over 50%, if they have 51%, 52%, 55% because of the termites, I don't have an issue with that. My issue is that whether it's 49%, 20%, or 55%, that needs to go to design review so the house is consistent with what it was supposed to be. So if the side wall he's replacing was 8 foot originally, the termite ate it, I don't want to drive by and see a 12-foot wall. You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm talking about. How you write it in the code, I'll leave it to you.
The word is remodel,
Well,
not build anew.
I would like to make sure that the concept that you suggested earlier with regard to termites is the one that comes back as an option, because that's the one I'm going to support, by the way.
Well, and the same with me.
Bring it back and let us see it.
Exactly what you mentioned.
We will spell it out and we'll go over it so that you'll know for sure what we put in
Yeah,
this
we can tweak it.
in the ordinance.
We
Yes.
can tweak it.
So that concludes the 4 items, and I understand there are more comments.
Oh, somebody dropped the bottle.
Excuse me. Now,
What kind of
I'd
a
like-
bottle was it?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We'll drive you to drink up here, right?
I just wanted to say, Mr. Hagani, when you talk about the comment about your staff coming back and telling you that the public, or not the public, but the people who want to do these things refer to the rooftop air conditioners as a roof tax. Here's what your staff can tell them, okay? Staff can tell them ma'am, sir, our homes and our neighborhoods are not just places where we live. They are, for many people, especially seniors, their retirement. They are also, those homes represent their largest investment that they're ever going to have. And they also represent, in some cases, a first start for their kids or their grandkids if they're going to leave that house to someone. And whenever alterations occur to a home that reach right into the homeowners, the neighbors' pockets and remove cash in the form of their property values, then whether you want to call it a roof tax to be smug and smart, or whether you want to call it complying with the code, is immaterial. The fact is, in my view anyway, and this is what I would say to you, in my view anyway, as an elected representative, those codes are there for exactly that reason, so that you don't have the right as a single homeowner to damage the property values, the look of a neighborhood, for everyone else that lives there. That's my view on it, and so blame it on me. Tell your staff blame it on the current mayor. Actually, tell them blame it on the mayor. That way, when I leave office, it'll just be the next guy.
Whoever is sitting there. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, ask a question now. What happens tonight? Now, this is on the agenda, correct?
We will take a look after this. It's unlikely that we can incorporate all of this in the ordinance.
Expect that.
No.
We'll probably ask you to continue to a date certain tonight.
What item is
so
is
Mr.
that?
Yosefian,
It's hearing item 9A, probably.
who has a few more questions on the other items.
That was the one that was, Councilman Weaver, I was going to suggest that information, the code amendments not relating to the 4 items we've discussed this afternoon, probably can be introduced today if the council wants to go forward on that, or they can just wait, put all the package it all together, since you're going to continue it to a date certain.
No, well, let me hear from Mr. Yusefian. Don't get into it now. We have too many questions right now as to whether we're going to go into it. My question is, do we have the time to do that and do it appropriately? We have 1 hour before we have our meeting.
I don't have a lot of questions, but some of them, I think clarifications I'm hoping for get.
Can you
There are
talk
other
to
people with
staff?
questions as well, Mr. Yusefian. So.
On the rest of, or do
Maybe
we
you can
want to
talk
do
to
another
staff.
study session?
Mr. Starbird, what I'm actually alluding to is
Mr. Mayor, given that we're not likely going to be able to do the work
Exactly.
necessary for you to have the ordinance this evening, if Mr. Yusefian could get with staff relative to all of his questions,
Thank you.
I'd like to spend some time before 6 o'clock figuring out what's a good date that we can adjourn tonight's public hearing to, so we're fairly comfortable we can get all of our work done between now and then, so we can bring you back an ordinance that will incorporate what I think is going to take a bit of discussion among staff as to how to carry out what you've given us clear direction on.
Well, there's no question in my mind anyway, Mr. City Manager, we're not going to be voting on this tonight.
No,
My question is, can we reasonably get into the rest of this evening? And this evening meaning now, and I think the answer is no.
The answer is no.
So let me see where my colleagues are. on
Mr.
it.
Mayor, if we're not going to do this tonight, the rest of it, then I'm for postponing that also for tonight. Then I will meet with the staff and deal with some of those
By the
items.
way, it doesn't mean that Mr. Yusefian or any of the rest of us aren't going to have questions when it comes back.
Yeah, right.
But, anyway, do I have the consensus of the
Yes.
council to do that? Yes, sir.
Between now and when it does come back, and this evening we'll have a date to bring it back, it would be very useful on these second set of items. If any of you that have questions, concerns, issues, you can get with Mr. Hagani so we can try and address them before they come back to you again.
Sounds good.
Okay.
And move to the adjourn for the council.
Second.
A motion and a second. We are adjourned.
Get together and